Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Core Conversations. I am Charlie Thomas, the Executive Director of ACTC, and Core Conversations is our online conversation series. Every one of these Core Conversations has two parts. Our speaker records remarks that are available on our website, and then we follow up with a conversation like the one we're going to have today. Um, uh, the schedule for Core Conversations is available on our website. This year's schedule has changed a little bit, so please have a look. And of course, I'll update you through email and on social media. If you're not on our mailing list, let me know though, and I'll add you, and that way you'll know what's going on. It is my pleasure today to introduce my colleague and chair of the philosophy department at Mercer University, Kevin Honeycutt. Kevin and I had a chance a couple of weeks ago to talk about Machiavelli and record his remarks, and they were, Kevin and I have opportunities to talk often, and I always enjoy and benefit from conversation with him about philosophy, and this was no exception. So I'm looking forward to kind of reviewing some of the interesting things that he mentioned in those brief remarks, and seeing what we can do. Kevin has been at Mercer for how many years now, Kevin? It's been
2014, I think it's
yeah, been since 2014, and works on Bertrand de Juvenel and on Machiavelli, and political philosophy generally, and history of philosophy generally. As well as being chair, he's also taken on some leadership roles with the faculty in
very
administrative work, and I appreciate him for that too. So Kevin, the floor is yours. Let's talk about Machiavelli.
Sure. Yeah, thanks y'all for coming. I just wanted to echo what Charlie said about the small crowd is perfectly fine for me. I'm used to running Zoom meetings for our House of Delegates that have, 60, 70, 80 people, and it's a little harder to manage. 6 is totally fine. So this is great. So just to real quickly, I don't want to assume you saw the remarks I recorded. I briefly talked in those remarks about Machiavelli's Prince, mainly why I use Machiavelli, why I used him in an intro to philosophy class, and how. And the gist of it is that I think it's a good book to train certain close reading skills, and also it carries forward themes that we have explored in Plato and Xenophon earlier in the course about what it means to be a human being, what philosophy is, what God is, things like that. There's certain questions I like to pick a few questions at the beginning of the course and just run them through all the texts for that semester. And the questions would be different if I were teaching political philosophy as opposed to intro to philosophy. And then but I just still have those questions that we focus on. And then, so in intro to philosophy, those are the big questions. What's philosophy? What's a human being? What is God? And then I usually have a fourth one. What is nature? Or this semester we're doing what is honor. So it's been really important in Xenophon's Hiero and Plato's Alcibiades, and then the Prince to explore that notion of honor as it rolls through. So I talked in my remarks about that mainly, why I use the book, how I use the book, and how I think the book is useful because it exposes students to weird peculiarities and discontinuities and tensions that it's a purportedly straightforward book. And I think a lot of people would think that this is by philosophical terms, a pretty straightforward book. But as I like to show students, I think that's not the truth. And so I focus my remarks mainly on the Prince, but I'd be happy to talk about whatever other questions people have.
All right, we can just jump in, you guys. I have a bunch of questions, but you don't need to raise your hand in a crowd this size. Please jump in, or I can get us started, whatever you prefer.
I'll be the first one to go, if that's all right. Sure. So, Kevin, I was able to briefly watch your remarks earlier that were recorded, and I really appreciated them. And during those remarks, you mentioned close reading. You just mentioned it again, that you like the Prince because it helps undergraduates learn the skills of close reading analysis of a core text. And I was interested because in your earlier remarks, you mentioned that this is a really loaded term for some fields. And so it's a loaded
Sure.
term in my field. Of course, people went to war over what is close reading in like the 80s and 90s. Um, but I'm interested in what you're trying to accomplish through close reading and what you're setting it opposed to, right? If the Prince is all about these binaries, right? That there's, women and men and fortune and virtue, or what was it, virtue or philosophy? I forget.
Yeah,
Virtue.
fortune. Yeah, sure.
Then what are we educating students out of to get them into close reading? So maybe more of a pedagogical question, but I'm really
Sure.
interested in learning how you assess where students are and then sort of guide them into that process. So where are you starting from with your students?
Yeah, I mean, I just one of the things. So I mentioned in those remarks too that I've coached before. I've coaching experience, and you have to start where players are if you want to try to improve someone. So this is why great players, I think, often make bad coaches, because it's difficult for them to kind of begin where their players are, even very good professional players, right? So I think it can be difficult sometimes when you know something, when you know a lot about something. To me, the distance is increasingly vast between us and the people that we're beginning with, especially in intro courses. So I just assume that they can't read, basically, that they're functionally illiterate, that they're used to just reading tweets or watching YouTube, and it seems to be the case. Often that they're attention span short. They just skim over things the way that they would do for most other classes. And so I'm trying to educate them out of that, I guess, just to say, look, it matters to pay attention. And it doesn't matter that this is a humanities class. As I said in those remarks, I often find engineers and scientists and accountants that if you get them to think of these things just as it's just data. This is a book. But it's not in principle different from the data that you're working in your field, and it's important to pay close attention to the data. I'm trying to educate them out of that, I guess, that what we want is just a fleeting peripheral understanding of what we're studying. And so I really focus on that. And these works, you can use different books, but these works that I've been using, I find are particularly useful for that. There's these, you can just start introducing them to things like, how works begin. For instance, I put a lot of emphasis on that for Xenophon, Plato, and Machiavelli. Like, what's the title? And there are two titles for the Prince, so that's weird, right? So how does it begin? What's the thing that the author's putting in front of us? And then just these strange things, which may or may not mean anything, like lists or changing the terminology. There's this one place where Xenophon says that the tyrant fears the decent, the wise, and the just. And then in the very next sentence, he talks about the brave, the wise, and the just, like in the next sentence. And so you just say, well, why would he do that? I mean, why did the decent become the brave in one sentence? And students wouldn't notice that otherwise. And they just start to notice things like that. And then I say, look, questions of interpretation are parasitic on noticing the detail. So the interpretive stuff, like what you think about the text, all that's irrelevant if you can't like read it carefully. And I have reading quizzes, and I just kind of first couple of weeks just knock their legs out from under them, really. Like, what did you pick up on this reading? And people will make 5s or 6s out of 25s, and they're like, okay, I really got to go, I got to go back to the text, So pedagogically, what I'm trying to do at the beginning is just to say, I think I said this in the remarks. It's like you have to read like your life depends upon it, because it does, And so this isn't a tweet. Out in the real world, you're competing with people that pay attention and that can process information well. And I find most people really pick up on that, and that they don't get hung up too much on the fact that, these are old books or something like that. It's just when they can see that the skills are broadly applicable to anything that they're studying, they buy into it, right? So I guess I would say, yeah, I mean, so close reading, I have since found, is a thing. But all I mean really is, like, I was a very technical soccer player, right? And I'm a technical chess player. And so I think I read that way too. And so I'm just trying to, I try to inculcate students like to read in a technical way, if that makes sense, like paying attention to detail. It's really just about paying attention, I guess. That's my pedagogical aim, because I'm really not trying to make them into philosophy majors or even turn them on to the liberal arts. There are transformative things about the liberal arts, but at the minimally, at least, I tell them if they buy in, I said, if you run and lift weights for 15 weeks, you'll just get faster and stronger. You just will. And like, if you read like we do for 15 weeks, you'll just be better at reading. And that will help you in your finance classes. That'll help you in your biology classes. If you want to go to med school or anything. And most of the time students buy in, I mean, there's always some that don't, but so I guess that's what I'm trying to do in intro classes. I'm not trying to convert people to philosophy or it's
That's
just
what a philosopher would say, of course. But
yeah.
yeah.
And I will
Do no
say, I
harm.
mean,
That's my pedagogy, right?
I will say that there is this interesting kind of oblique move that happens as someone who
Mhm.
teaches in the department with Kevin and who teaches students who've been in his classes. He makes this appeal, which is sincere, that this kind of learning to read in this way will benefit you in all of these different ways. But what happens is that students, some of them, obviously not all, realize that some books will sustain this activity better than others and will yield more when you give them more, and then they get drawn in. And so we do get students who are drawn into our history of philosophy courses, in part because the books we're doing there will actually repay the efforts that they've now learned to make in reading, which is a kind of not a way that I would have imagined we would recruit students into the major, but it's definitely happened.
Yeah, it's on numerous occasions in recent years. I've had students say that they became a philosophy major because of how seriously we treat books compared to other departments. And I don't think the students mean that as a slight on other departments. It's just that we really pay so much attention and they're interested in books, yes, that can sustain that scrutiny and doing that themselves. That's some of them. That's why they, I think, came to college and wanted to do things like that, and they haven't found it yet. And then they just find it in this weirdo place in a gen ed class or something. So
Yeah.
I don't put any emphasis on like theories of reading or anything like that. I just say, look, we're just going to do it, and we're going to learn how to do it by doing it. And I think it is wonky sometimes when people observe me. They're like, "What? Why are you paying so much attention to these weeds?" But the point is to learn how to do that. I guess that in a way these books are great books, but it's accidental that I'm using the Prince. I think the Prince sustains that type of critique very well, but I mean, I could use another great book and I think it would work. And I have, so.
Yeah. So what you're doing in the classroom is a lot of walking them through it. Of that, you're also asking a lot in terms of the quizzes. And so there's also a reward slash coercive element there as well. I'm thinking through the ways to sort of instruct students in teaching closely without just doing it for them, or asking them questions that they don't answer. So that's really helpful for that conversation and thinking through how we can incorporate more of that in the classes I teach. So
yeah, I think it's just I've just found it doesn't always work well. It depends on but I found over time, like if you in the Alcibiades, if it just starts by saying son of Clinias, and so you just say, why doesn't it start with Alcibiades? That's the title, right? Starts with son of Clinias, and then one of the questions I ask on a reading quiz is who was Alcibiades' mother, which I never cover in class, right? But because it begins with his father, and we spend so much emphasis on that, I just ask a question. Sometimes it's bonus, and sometimes it's just a straight up question, like who was his mother, who's mentioned one time, like up to that point in the quiz. And a decent number of students will answer it. They might get the spelling kind of wrong, but they'll answer it correctly because I think it makes sense to them to even look for that because we've spent so much time on the father, So I don't show them how to do it, but then if they miss that question, then the next time. And if they miss how does it start the next time, they definitely pay attention to how it starts. So some of it you do it, and some of it you have to let them really screw it up. But I dropped the two lowest quizzes, and so if they really screw it up, then it's fine. But you're right; it's a fine line between. I think I have probably become a caricature of myself in terms of like showing them how to do it as opposed to letting them do it. But then I suppose that happens to all of us. So. I don't know.
Thank you.
The other thing I kind of want to mention in this context, because this is ACTC, is that a lot of the students that come to philosophy at Mercer, not all of them, but many of them also have taken at least one or two great books classes. And so sometimes they're coming to these books for the second time. And a part of what happens when Kevin does his thing is that they have a sense of how much they missed. And it sort of affects, because we're always reading ourselves, right? In these interdisciplinary cortex seminars, whether we know it or not, we're always reading ourselves. And so I think these moments where that becomes visible are really powerful. And it can be one of the ways that within a core curriculum, there can be a very real kind of development, even if in a lot of other ways we don't do things in a self-consciously kind of scaffolded way. And so that makes me, think of two things really here. One is the one I just said, that the core program and the disciplinary program really support each other in this way. And I think it's one thing that often when we're talking about core programs and thinking about teaching loads, for example, and how we're going to balance our time between contributions to core programs and disciplinary teaching, I think sometimes we neglect the extent to which they can, in really meaningful ways, support each other, such that if you're teaching in the core program, you may actually be doing service to your department in a way that I don't think we always are aware of, or we don't frame it that way for ourselves often enough. And then the other thing is the sense that of understanding what your colleagues are doing in a way that sort of contributes to the student's experience, and in a sense kind of takes that off of your plate. I mean, I don't do this stuff that Kevin does, not in the same way, but I know they're getting it, and I know that I value it, and it's a part both of our Great Books program and of our philosophy major, that there's this substantial cohort of students who've had this kind of instruction. But we don't all have to do the same things. But I do think it's incredibly powerful when we become aware of what each other are doing and think about the ways that we teach as sort of complementary parts of the student experience.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say real quick is that thing about missing things, that often happens, I think, with Machiavelli. Like if students read Thucydides, that they probably have never read it before. And so they might be missing a lot, but it's just that, my Great Books 1 students have never read Thucydides, none of them. And, but a lot of people have read The Prince in high school, or a lot of them have read it in a political theory course or something. And so then when I do it with them, it's sometimes those students who have the most jarring experience, because they think they know what's going on and they've read it before and they've missed all this other stuff. So some Great Books are more familiar to students than other ones. And it's an interesting experience, I think, when the familiar becomes strange in that way, I guess. But.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll open it up to someone else, but that's really interesting and thoughtful. Yeah.
I think one of the things that we've done in biblical studies courses, I taught for years the freshman course that went through the Gospel of Matthew. So the very first thing you do is give them the birth account. Half the class had the birth account in Matthew, half of them had the account in Luke, and they had to lay out what was in each, and then they had to lay them out in order that the text presents it, and then what was missing. And they're like, wait a minute, why isn't this here? And why isn't this here? Because they simply supplied it because of their prior knowledge. And often it wasn't from reading the text, it was prior knowledge from broader culture. So I was curious as to what your students tended to bring into something like The Prince. What is that prior knowledge that screws them up, keeps them from seeing what's there?
Yeah, in English, Machiavellian is like this byword for treachery or something, and so I think and I'm not saying that's a misread of Machiavelli. I think the book, he and the book have this reputation of this would be good if you want to you want to be a CEO, or if you want to be in the hard-nosed world of business, or if you want to kind of know how to survive amongst the sharks or something. There's stuff to that. But I think one of the things that is jarring, I think, is how much moderation there is in the book. That in fact, when you look at the book, he's not counseling to do these like things people think he's counseling to do, right? Be cruel or take people's money or only look after your own interests or something like that, like betray people. It's very, very rare he actually puts forward those things as proposals to imitate. In fact, usually what he does is, but when he puts forward people who do things like that, he shows that they get killed or that they lose their possessions or something like that. So the book starts to look like the opposite of what they expected it to be about. But even if that doesn't happen, there's all this stuff that's missing, so I like Greg's example of the biblical account, that all these things that are missing that should be there, glaring omissions sometimes, and then these things that they've brought to it but aren't there, you know. I mean, he constantly talks about people who are cruel, for instance, but being cruel is a very, very tricky matter. And so, you know, all of our students, or all of us probably, are conditioned to see cruelty as a very and it's an especially bad vice, I think, in liberal democracies, right? Since Montaigne and you know, it's a what does he call it? In a natural vice, I don't remember. So is that what he calls it?
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
that it's you know, bullying, shaming, all these things in kind of contemporary culture. Cruelty, it comes in for a special invective, and so the fact that he's constantly talking about cruel people or seeming to recommend cruelty, and then we look at whether he actually does that, you know, whether it's actually in the Bible or whatever, you know, it's. I think students want to read the book because they think it will help them, be a shark or something. And there is advice in there about how to survive in a very dangerous world. But it's not always by being dangerous yourself. In fact, I'd say it's rarely the case that would be his advice, you know. But it does play to the, you know, I get a lot of business school types that are just taking a general education course, and that's why they're in the course. And it does play to them if you can give them leadership advice, or, you know, like when you say, if you join a company, you know, do all your bad things up front. That's what Machiavelli's saying, clean house or whatever. Like, don't persist in those things, or don't do them later. Like, you can always get easier, but you can't get harder, you know? And so there is hard-nosed practical advice that he gives them. So you can play on that, you know. Some of the things that expect it to be in the
if we want to,
there, right?
We want a real world test case of this. I just heard this morning on the radio that Elon Musk has said that when the deal with Twitter goes through, that he's immediately firing 75% of Twitter's employees. So so we'll see if this doing the bad at the beginning well, maybe we will. Maybe we'll see if it works out for him. But this is actually something that Machiavelli says, right? This is he says this is if you're going to do it, do it. He doesn't say do it, but he says if you're going to do it, right? Yeah.
So sort of. So this is one of the things we talk about in class, right? So in 8, which is about how you acquire a principality through crime, chapter 8, which is not in. He never said he's going to talk about this up until now, and then he just kind of throws it on you. And he gives this ancient example of a guy, Agathocles, the Sicilian, who does all this crazy stuff. I mean, he kills people, and he does all these outrageous things. Infinite crimes, Machiavelli calls them. That's a lot, as I tell students. Infinite crimes. And Machiavelli says, how could this guy who's committed infinite crimes and you know, betrayed one's friends and killed the rich and all this type of stuff, how is it that he's never conspired against by his people, and that his regime is secure? And he says it's because of these things he calls cruelties well used, right? And so it becomes about how you use cruelty. And so that's one thing. At that point, I introduced this idea that maybe these things we take to be good can be used poorly. He talks about mercy badly used in chapter 17. And these things that are ostensibly bad can be used well. So we have to rethink maybe what it means to be good or bad. But one of the things he says there, is that if you're going to do you review the offenses you're going to take and do them all at the beginning. Okay. But that's not all he says, right? So in other words, if Elon Musk read the print, you'd say that's in there, you know. And so again, so to Randall's, to this point earlier, this pedagogical point, I'd say, look, if I grade from the bottom up, so I say, I'm not looking for mistakes. I'll say sin bravely and things like that all the time. Well, what I want is for you to say more and use the text more. So I really incentivize not being afraid to make mistakes, that I don't count off from mistakes. I'm trying to see like what you can do, right? And so I say a good answer would be cruelties well used require you to do everything up front. You know, Elon Musk read that far, or maybe that's in the water to get to Greg's point, you know. But he says other things too, where like you don't persist in it. So if Elon Musk is going to do this, I think Machiavelli would say that means you don't fire people later, right? Which I'm sure Elon Musk will not follow, right? And the other thing is that you do it out of the necessity to secure yourself, to preserve yourself, right? You don't just come in to send a message like I'm going to clean house, right? So cruelties well used are, and then they're not. So these things are done all up immediately, only if they're necessary, and they're not persisted in. And he said, if you don't do that, you always have to keep the knife in your hand. He says, right? You're never going to be secure. So if you so a good answer would say, yeah, do it all at the beginning. But I would say a better answer would be to include those other parameters. And when you start including those other parameters, you start to wonder whether it would be a good idea to do that at all, right? Like, when is it really necessary to fire 75% of your people? Maybe you could get the same message across by firing 10% or something. Yeah, I mean, like maybe not even that much. So in other words, I think when you start looking at all these qualifications, yeah, it's very clear to me. Businessmen have not read it, right? But this is Keynes's point, right? That like hard-nosed business people are always the slave of some defunct economic idea that they haven't read, but they think they're very practical, you know. so Elon Musk has read enough of The Prince to be dangerous, I guess, is what I would say. And the stuff that's missed, sometimes that's the key stuff. Like, I don't know that Machiavelli would say it's a good idea to take over a company and fire 75% of the people. I just don't know that he would say that.
So maybe the real question here is exactly how did you become chair, Kevin?
That's right. That's right. It's because the previous chair didn't want to do it anymore.
And he did it because the previous chair didn't want to do it anymore.
But you know, it is true that, like, you know, these things, there are these practical lessons, right? Like, whenever you become there's going to be friction just because you're new. This is what Machiavelli says, and he's right. So like, I'm a new chair, and just the fact that I'm new and that I'm different than the other chair, especially for the other chair, you know, although he just took a year sabbatical, which helps gives him distance, but especially for him, but even for everybody else, it's different. And just because it's different, there's some friction. And I think Machiavelli's right about that. Like, people get accustomed to a certain way that things should be, and it feels natural to them. And then when things change, it you know, it can be jarring just because it's different, you know. And so Elon Musk taking over Twitter will be jarring enough just because it's different. And so that might be all the more reason not to fire 75% of your people. But I don't know. Whatever. Yeah.
Daniel, you had your. I'm sorry, Greg. Go ahead. I just wanted to let everybody know Daniel had his hand up. But please, Greg, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't see the hand. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Daniel.
We can't hear you. I saw the mute go off, but we still don't hear you. I think we have technical issues, Daniel. Greg, why don't you go ahead and maybe if you Daniel, if you want to put something in the chat, I can I'd be happy to ask it for you, or Kevin can see it for himself.
So I was just going to follow up on your last comments, Kevin, and ask if you. It sounded like in your comments, your recorded comments, that part of what you were doing is switching the categories to issues around virtue and fortune. Are you able to get some more of this detail, like some of these caveats that he's putting in? Do these things up front, but the longer you go, you can't do these because of all these other issues. Do you get to some of that level of detail because you switch the categories from how do I rule to what's virtue? Oh, he's applauding. That's why.
Okay, good.
Yeah. No, it's all right. Yeah, it's yeah,
Does
maybe
the
it was
question make
hand
sense?
clapping. Maybe that's what it was. Yeah. So okay, you mean, so your question is, tell me if I'm understanding your question correctly. Can I get to some of these places because I'm asking different questions of the book? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So if you're asking it from a management standpoint, you know, how much change do you make at the beginning? Okay,
Sure,
you're going to read the text for those things.
Yeah.
And then he's going to have all these caveats. But if you're switching the categories to things like virtue and fortune, are you going to get some of that understanding? Are you going to be able to, are the students able to track that, you know, this might be cruel, but it has certain, let me see if I can word that right. This might seem like vice, but that it has its limitations to it. By asking the questions about virtue, vice, fortune, are you able to get some of the detail of what you were just discussing about Elon Musk?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would not, I might or might not bring up Elon Musk, but or a student might, and then we would talk about it. But I do often, you know, just refer to some contemporary thing as this is why these books are timeless, you know, that you can mine them for information. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Detail, yeah, to get to the level of detail that the text is talking about. I'm not as concerned about Elon Musk, but it sounds like Machiavelli himself is adding all of these caveats on there.
Sure.
And how do you help them see that that's what he's doing?
Well, I think so we can't focus on everything, you know, and I say these in those remarks that your leading questions really, the questions you're looking for. So usually we look for nature, you know, this time I'm not talking much about nature at all. It's just not one of our course questions. I mean, Machiavelli talks a lot about nature, and so does Plato, and so does Xenophon, but we're just not really paying attention to it. But we're looking for honor. And so the honor stuff is just popping up everywhere because we're looking for it. So because we look for what is philosophy, I mean, the word itself doesn't show up often in the books we read, but then we think, well, do philosophers show up, or does wisdom show up? I mean, right at the beginning of the High Road, Simonides is reputed to be wise. And so I said, well, one of our big questions for the course is, what is philosophy? For the Greeks, philosophy meant love of wisdom. He's reputed to be wise. And then later we're told that the tyrants fear the wise. And I said, well, what does that mean? And just ask them to kind of put the questions together, right? And so the same thing with Machiavelli, we're looking for wisdom. He doesn't talk about what philosophy is. And it's disputed whether Machiavelli is even a philosopher. I mean, I you know, it's not important to me, but he talks about wise princes a lot. And so I said, if we detach prince from like ruling a country, none of you are going to be king of France or something, you know, but you will be in leadership positions, surely. And we just read Plato's Alcibiades, where rule is about ruling yourself, knowing yourself, taking care of yourself. And so that notion of rule about ruling yourself, being a prince of yourself, the advice might still apply. And then also what it means to be a wise prince, that might mean being a philosopher, and it might mean being something else. And so then we start to look at those examples of what a wise prince would do. And in fact, eventually, you know, I can ask pretty demanding questions of them. Like I will give them a multiple choice question where there'll be a dozen things or something. And I'll say, which one is explicitly not what a wise prince would do, you know? And if they've taken good notes and they've paid attention, and in worst case, they go back and look at all the places and they have figured out, right? Or I'll say, which person was not explicitly called virtuous by Machiavelli in this list of 15 people or something, right? And then partly it's because we've been paying attention to that stuff, but certain figures start to emerge if you're looking for wisdom, or if you're looking at for God or for human beings, but then some I always focus on. So you can focus on Cesare Borgia, for instance, and the stuff he does is illustrative for all sorts of reasons, for leadership, for imitation. But there are a lot of figures that we just wouldn't pay attention to because of the questions we're asking. Modern Italian figures, often we don't pay too much attention to except for him. But the classical figures, you know, are interesting. You know, like the fact that Moses has a teacher is something the students probably would not notice. But because we focus so much on Moses and his cohort in chapter 6, that point just kind of pops for them, right? So part of it is the examples you pick and the questions, I guess, that you're reading for. There's a lot, I'm sure, that I mean, we have a colleague in political science who's very philosophical, I would say, and he reads the book similar to me, but differently enough. He's focusing on the political stuff that there's a lot of things his students will pick up on things that mine are missing because the questions are different. But can you get to the detail? Yeah, I mean, we get pretty detailed in terms of some of the stuff we do. But partly it's just because you know, you can condition business students to look at things very closely. You just can. I mean, my my students do. So it can be done.
Yeah, so it sounds like
it's hopeful, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's pedagogically hopeful that even as their attention span is shot and they're used to reading tweets and they communicate via memes or whatever, that you can get them to like really pay attention in a sustained way to a book. And so the damage that we all suffer is not permanent, I guess. So,
what it sounds like, much like with ACTC, people from different disciplines will help enrich the conversation for the details that they see and that others are missing.
That's why I think, that's why seminar type discussions are so valuable, because people come to books with fresh eyes or from different disciplinary backgrounds, and they'll just see things other people don't see. Sometimes astonishing little details. I was just pointing one out to Charlie the other day that one of my students noticed something in Thucydides that, I mean, I didn't see. And it was just, that's the joy of doing things in a group, you know? So anyway, I don't know if I got to the question. I think I did, right?
Fine. Yeah.
A lot of us, the how, you know, but I mean,
Yep.
a lot of us are not taught how to teach or how to do things. And I had to fumble along for a very long time figuring things out. I don't know that I still know how to do it, but I at least know how it works for what I want to do. And that's part of, I figured it out. But
We have maybe 10-ish, a little bit more minutes left, and I definitely have a question, but I will not ask it if Pam or Daniel would, or Randall or Greg would like to ask another one. Anybody want to jump in?
Well, I do have a question.
Good.
So, and Kevin, it's for you and for anyone else in the room. One of the things that I've noticed lately when I'm teaching these lower division GE courses, and we're looking at works, currently we're looking at Dante, and the tendency of students not to be intellectually curious enough to look up words they don't know. And also their inability to think about synonyms. And an example would be, I was talking to a student who just couldn't get circle 2, the lust circle, because she had never encountered the word lust. And I said, okay, what do you think you would call somebody who really wanted sex all the time? And she said, horny. And I said, okay, so now let's just replace anytime you see the word lust or lustful, you think of the word horny. And her eyes just went really, really big, and it clicked with her in a way that it didn't. But how do you, Kevin, how do you, in the rest of the people in the Zoom world, how do you get people to look up words they don't know instead of just blipping over them?
I mean, partly you can, one of the things I do, I'll just say very quickly, two things do. One is one of our teachers at Emory, mine and Charlie's, used to say that modern people are fearless and shameless, which I'm not so sure is true. I mean, my students still respond to shame. You know, if I ask them what a word means and nobody knows, I was like, look, it's GRE time, it's SAT time. What does this word mean? And nobody knows. I said, this is ludicrous. Look it up. You've all got your computers and phones in front of you. Look it up, right? And so you just, after about a dozen times of making fun of them, basically, that they don't know what lust means or something, and good naturedly, I don't mean I'm kind of, they start to look things up, I guess, hopefully. The other thing is, I think, yes, many of my students do not know I mean, the analogies are no longer on the SAT, for instance, right? They were taken off 10 or 15 years ago. And so analogical reasoning is something that almost none of my students are very good at. And it's very important in Machiavelli right off the bat that there's this crucial analogy in the dedicatory letter. And I just try to walk them through certain examples like that. Or I talk about the difference between, very briefly, without getting into technical terms. Is that a pug?
That's 3 pugs.
3 pugs.
3 times.
I used to have a pug.
Stairs.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, part of it is just when they start to slow down and pay attention, I hope that they are not afraid to look words up, and or you can just kind of do this publicly. And I only do this with students that I feel can sustain a little bit of public good-natured ridicule, right? I don't just cold call on people or something. But yeah, it's tough. If you've never heard of the word lust and it's too big a word to look up, that's a tough place to start. But you know, you have to start where people are. I mean, I distinctly remember when I was coaching at a women's college in Virginia, and one of the players asked, this was a soccer team, she said, how can I get more playing time? I said, well, learn to kick a ball 5 yards. You know, I was like, and I'll help you do that. I said, this is college soccer. If you cannot pass a ball 5 yards, why are you expecting to play, right? But that's where she was. And so you just kind of have to meet them there. So I thought what you did, Pam, was great. Instead of saying lust, you know, like we're not talking about sphygmomanometer or something. I mean, you've never heard of the word lust. You just put it in terms that they can understand, you know, which is harder for all of us now because we're not cool and we don't know slang and stuff. But I mean, we can ask them what their slang is and try to translate it. I do not have a good answer for you, though, because you're right. I think one of the nice things about using the Alcibiades is it really focuses on ignorance, and you can just kind of really drill home the profound ignorance that we all have about almost everything. And then I have found students, when it's okay to accept that you're ignorant, they just stop being afraid, I guess, to ask questions as much, or that's the idea anyway.
I think that's a great idea because one of the things they fear the most is to be caught not knowing something. And yet, that's the reason, ostensibly, they're at universities to learn things, and to be afraid to say, I don't know. It just seems so, I don't know about a lot of things, but I want to learn.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think Plato's really useful for that. He's useful for a lot of things in core conversations, right? But one of the things Plato's useful for, and that dialogue in particular, is saying that it's okay to be ignorant and that there are different types of ignorance. And really, it's like being like having a substance abuse problem or something. I mean, you have to admit you have a problem. That you're not open to education until you say, you know, I don't know something. And it's okay. And most of us don't know things, and you should say, I don't know something. And so I think the other way to do it is just to model it. So just like you model the reading techniques and stuff, I say, I don't know in class all the time, you know, whether I know the answer or not, I just say, I don't know. And then I say, well, let's see if we can find it. Where was it? What chapter was it in that Machiavelli said this, you know? Or sometimes I challenge them. I was like, I'll give you a 20-second head start. I'll find it in 2 seconds, you know, like, where is it? And then they just start to, you know, but often I don't know, you know, interpretive questions. I don't know. I don't know what Machiavelli's intention is. I don't know whether he's really sincere about his piety. I mean, and then when you just, I have had people not respond to that well, though. So in the same class, I got two course evaluations. One was, I really like how Professor Honeycutt does not try to BS answers and admits when he's ignorant, and it kind of shows an intellectual humility. And someone else just excoriated me. They said, I pay all this money to go to school for my teacher just to constantly say they don't know anything. So it doesn't play to everybody, you know, but.
I'm going to sneak my question in the last minute here because
Sure.
we really only do have 5 minutes or so. So I'll be super quick. And I know you have a lot to say about this. But, you know, just another thing that I think is really important and interesting is the way that our teaching interacts with the work that we do for publication and research and that sort of thing. And that's definitely the case for you, I know. And one of the things that you've thought a lot about that I think folks here would be interested in is some of the sort of allusions to art and artistry and visual cultural things in Machiavelli.
Yeah.
I mean, Machiavelli, I don't have these dates firmly in mind, but something like 1460s to 1520s, something like that, are his dates. So he's at ground zero
High Renaissance,
for Florentine Renaissance art, deeply connected to the Medici, all of that stuff, had an office in the Palazzo Signoria, the whole thing. So, I mean, I wonder if you could, like, the 5-minute version of a few thoughts on Machiavelli's thought interacting with Florentine art and artists.
Sure. Yeah, this is I would say almost nobody thinks this is important, and I have never figured out why. Because Machiavelli lives in the High Renaissance. He's living in Florence. I mean, Michelangelo's David's outside the Palazzo della
Signoria.
He's working there, I think, right? It's down low, and then He knew Leonardo. He collaborated with Leonardo to help Cesare Borgia on various projects. I think he mentions Michelangelo in a letter about he asked somebody to collect money from Michelangelo and stuff. And of course, just being in town and working for the government, he would know all these people. I mean, it's like people who say that Aristotle hasn't really read the Republic or something. There are serious Plato scholars who make these charges, right? And I'm not saying they're ludicrous, but it just seems to me, if Aristotle was at the academy for 20 years and Plato was there for 17 of them, the burden of proof that he doesn't understand Plato should be astonishingly high, right? I mean, maybe he doesn't understand Plato, but probably he does. And so and so maybe we should rethink what we think Plato's saying or something. So Machiavelli's living in Florence. He's living in the High Renaissance. And you'll see serious Machiavelli scholars who I respect, and I am not at all making fun of, and not just because this is being recorded or anything, right? I would say it to their faces. I have said it to their faces, like, why in the world do you think Machiavelli's not interested in art? And they're like, well, he never talks about art. I said, but he does. He uses words that artists use. I mean, the word he uses for sketching, they always translate it sketching, or often in the dedicatory letter, people who sketch landscapes. It's related to the word disegno. So it's this huge artistic debate between Florence and Venice about whether drawing is more primary than painting. And in Florence, drawing is more primary. It's very technical, and drawing does not mean like sketching on a napkin. It's like blueprint type drawings or very polished drawings. And so when Machiavelli's using a word that is deployed in the artistic debates of his day to talk about drawing, and he's a Florentine, it seems to me, surely you would ask about the artistic context of Florence. And people just dismiss it. Not only are they not interested in exploring it, they just think it's not interested at all. He's just not interested in art, with very few exceptions. I think past few years I've seen people starting to come around to the fact that, like, well, David's a really important symbol for the city of Florence, and there are these major Florentine people like creating statues of David all the time, and maybe that's interesting. Like he gives David a knife, for instance, in Prince 13, that David doesn't have in the biblical story, clearly, right? But in at least one statue, what is it? It's Raphael's bronze, I think, right? The head's cut off. I mean, there's all this, it's just
Donatello's bronze.
It's Donatello's. Okay, yeah. So I got interested in this partly because he talks about this distinction between seeing and touching, about whether it's better to see things, or like what's a kind of truer way to interpret them. And so I really got into this for a few years, about, sculptors would take touching to be primary, and painters would take seeing to be primary. And there are interesting things in the Bible about this that a lot of Renaissance painters are tapping into. So Mary Magdalene's the first person to see Christ when he's risen, but she can't touch him. She's forbidden to touch him, right? And then Thomas is incredulous and has to touch, right? And he becomes a symbol for Florentine jurisprudence later, putting your hand on the Bible and all that type of stuff, right? So I got really interested in this stuff about seeing versus touching, and the prints, and what we now call the haptic experience. I mean, we're all constantly touching our phones, touching our screens and stuff. All experience is very haptic, right? And it's not, it is visual, but it's haptic in a way that it was not, I think, even a few decades ago, maybe even 10 years ago or so. And I think the answer to that has to rely in the artistic context. For him, what does touching mean and stuff like that? It has to rely there, or it has to reside there. And almost nobody's interested in paying attention to it. And I can't figure out why. It just seems to me obvious that you would look at it. But I have to say, I've never been able to put those pieces together, except by looking at his language, right? Like he uses these words imported from, as far as I can tell, it's an everyday Italian word, but it has artistic resonance. Or he'll use words like giornata, which can mean day or battle, but it's also like, I think, how much painter fresco in a certain day.
Term, yeah.
So there's these words with artistic resonance that he uses a lot, and it doesn't. Who knows if it means anything? But it's interesting to ask if it does mean something, right? I mean, and he uses examples of David, right? And anyway, so everybody interprets him in terms of like the military and political context, and they just seem to dismiss almost out of hand that he would be interested in art, even though the only prose work he published during his lifetime is called The Art of War. Right? And he says the most important thing to know, right, is to be a professional in the art of war in Prince chapter 14. And that art could just be like the Greek word techne or something, right? But I mean, it could mean art, I mean, And the people he's friends with are very technical artists. They're not just, throwing their opinions up on a canvas or something, right? It's not Jackson Pollock type stuff, not to deride Jackson Pollock. But I mean, Leonardo, Michelangelo, they're very precise technical sculptors and drawers. And so the way he thinks about art, it seems to me, would be like that. If there's an art of war, it might be a very technical, detail-oriented thing. So I'm very interested in that, partly because we've done these study abroad trips in Europe, philosophy and art study abroad trips. And also it just seems to me obvious, and I've never gotten a good answer, and I can't figure it out for myself. And people who think it's silly just tell me it's silly. And maybe it is, but I don't know. I mean, well, people look at Plato's context and they look at Hobbes's context and stuff like that. I don't know. I don't get it. But yes, I am interested in it. But then when you start looking for that stuff in the prints, it is very different. Like maybe the word giornata does not mean a battle. Maybe he's talking about what work you can get done in a day. And it's hard to know that without being, I think, which I am not, exceptionally strong in Renaissance Italian or something like that. So, yeah. And maybe nobody really is these days that much working in English. And that's part of the reason why people, or they don't have the chops. You all have probably found this too, that like we get, even those of us who are committed to broader conversations and core programs and great books and reading the text and having a tradition of inquiry, we're all ignorant about so many things. And it could be that a lot of the people that are super interested and knowledgeable about military political stuff, they're just not interested or knowledgeable about the art stuff, Yeah. I think this is partly why a lot of philosophers don't work on Machiavelli anyway, is because it's partly why I prefer the prints to the discourses on Livy, honestly, is because my Roman stuff is just much weaker than some of my other stuff. And the discourse on Livy is so much harder for me as a result, and it just.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember.
Anyway, that's probably long but short.
No, it's a great answer, and we've got to stop here. Just a 30-second indulgence. It reminds me of being in India and finding a sculpture of Kali that was weird and broke a lot of rules, and I was really interested in, and knowing that probably within a kilometer of where I was standing, there were 20 people who could tell me all about that sculpture, but they didn't write anything down. I didn't know who they were, and I didn't have the language. And so this sense that we're always operating, maybe not quite that attenuated a situation, but we're always operating in a kind of imperfect landscape of information and knowledge, and we have to make choices. Well, I'm pretty excited, pretty happy with my choice to invite you to do this today, Kevin. I thought it was great, and I really deeply appreciate our friends out there at Fresno Pacific who got up early to join us for this conversation.
Oh, that's right. My goodness, California. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And on top of it, they're on mid-semester break, so these
unbelievable.
Guys are using their holiday to.
We're on fall break too. So look at us. Whatever virtue is,
I was going to say whatever virtue is or means, y'all have to have some of it. So.
All right. And those of you who are watching this recording, thank you for joining us too. Look for other core conversations and other events coming up for ACTC. We'd love to see you. Take care.
Thanks for coming.